Hello, everyone. I am Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby here with Siddhartha Khosla, composer for Only Murders in the Building. And Sid, this is your third season with the show. You've already given it a strong musical identity. So, what is the process when you enter into a new season? How do you kind of take that identity, that music, and stretch it into a new direction?
Well, as you've seen with the show goes in different obtuse directions in like the most artful way. And so, I have early conversations with John Hoffman and our editors on the show as well. We have sort of, conversations before the season starts, before they start shooting. So I have a sense of where we're going. Um, and I start writing themes sort of ahead of time, just to sort of you know, get sort of like a new language or a new dialect for the season, um, and that's how it works. And so, for season three, we knew there was going to be this big musical component, and Pasek and Paul, our amazing songwriters, did a phenomenal job with their team, and Sarah Bareilles and Mark Shaman and all these incredible people. But there was still so much mystery and tension, and I found myself having, have found myself scoring more than I ever scored before in the show, with all the new characters. So, for example, last season two, I knew there was going to be this love theme that would need to be there between Meryl Streep and Marty Short's characters, and it emerged, and it also I created a Meryl Streep focused theme, a Loretta theme. So these are the kinds of things that I had to think of beforehand. And on a show like this, we don't have tons of time, so it's we get the cuts, score them, they're in, and especially since the score is sort of baked into the identity of the show. The themes and the ideas have to be there sort of early on in these cuts, so editors can play with them, and I can write early ideas down. So time, because time is of the essence too. Writing ahead of time helps.
Yeah. Those, you mentioned these themes. Do you kind of consider, approaching things from like a character-based perspective? Is that would you say is your main entryway?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's look, as you've heard with the main theme of the show, my sort of like the my starting point always is melody, and it's just I want to have just I'm a singer songwriter before I was ever a composer for TV and film, so I think of everything like these little songs, and because of that, I think in terms of a hook, and so I've tried to find ways to incorporate these melodies. As best as I can around even newer characters. But this season, the ensemble grew so much in such a beautiful way. The show became more sprawling all of a sudden, and so Ben Gilroy's character, and Loretta, those two particularly had their own themes, and so for Loretta specifically, I saw early sort of footage of Meryl in the show, and I'm pinching myself that I'm even saying me saying Meryl, but seeing her performance informed me in terms of what I needed to do. Same with Paul Rudd as Ben's character. Seeing just how they were on screen spoke to me already, and for Loretta. There was a sadness to her character as well. There was like sort of like the issue, the sort of the sadness in her being a mother, you know, and the complications of being a mother and those challenges, and so when I saw her on screen, I also had to hear a instrument playing her, and I saw Meryl Streep, and I thought of a French horn. It felt elegant, sophisticated, beautiful, classic, and emotive, and that's sort of the instrument that I used for her.
Mm. I know, speaking of Meryl Streep, there's I was rewatching some of it earlier, and one of my favorite like little musical cues happens after she auditions in that first episode,
Yeah.
and there's just like there starts to be these little twinkling, very subtle of like piano keys underneath her before she finally gets the role, and it kind of opens up,
Hmm.
and the music really explodes and takes you into, to the next break. How do you kind of play with that subtlety and decide when is it going to be big, when is it going to pull back?
This show is just a collaboration, and it's not always my decision. It's oftentimes the editors and I are getting together, and and we work hand in hand. And so there's such a nice relationship we have. In that first episode, it was edited by Shelley Westerman, and Shelley and I sort of worked together, to sort of like to frame and shape that music in terms of what it was going to be. I think if you start with a good melody and a theme, then it can go in a million different directions. And as long as we have that, we can be small and still hear the da 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 da. That's her. That was da 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 da. That was the Meryl Streep French horn melody. And so there were times where it felt appropriate to just break it down to just the melody or just the piano playing the melody. And other times, as she's walking through the streets of New York and she's going through all her struggles as an actor inside the show, we see that I have to sort of like cover decades of emotion and pain and trauma and all that other stuff. And so when you have to cover that scope, then it gets bigger. And when she's speaking and she's, doing what Meryl Streep does, which is, blow everyone away with the way she acts, you kind of sit out a little bit. You let her do her thing, and I support it subtly.
Yeah. It's really nice hearing all of the different types of instruments in this score. There's a lot of use of strings, and I I'm always wondering, like, do you kind of hear an instrument right away when you think of a piece, or does that take some experimentation? What's that orchestration process?
Well, I think, yeah, I do hear instruments right away, and part of the reason why we chose to have an orchestra. There's a live orchestra playing on every episode of this series, which is, I feel so fortunate to have that, especially in this day and age where budgets get sort of contracted, and there's sort of like an expectation that composers can make any sounds they need to make from the little keyboards we've got, and it's going to be great. And it's just not the case. When you have live players, it changes everything. And I've been really fortunate to have it from season one, every episode. So first, kudos to my incredible orchestra. Without them, this score isn't what it is. And in terms of the sounds of the orchestra, I chose orchestra because I wanted to know like what it sounded like inside the walls of the Arconia. What that was the sort of like fabric of our show. Like there's a history. It's a pre-war building. It's a deep history, and so chamber ensemble orchestra felt sort of appropriate. And so in that there's sort of like there's a handful you choose between. There's not a limitless number of sort of instruments in a traditional orchestra, right? So you have your woodwinds, you have your strings, you have horns, and so you kind of choose between all that. And so for Meryl, as I said, I heard French horn right away, and for Paul Rudd's character, I heard just something a little quirkier, because he was such a
Mm.
interesting, odd character in the show. And so I actually used this sort of like Beatles era mellotron that I have to play some of the string stuff along with our orchestra for him.
Well, speaking of quirky, one of my favorite themes, I think, is the White Room
Yeah.
theme, where Steve Martin kind of disassociates as he attempts to sing Pickwick Triplets.
Hmm.
What was the process? It's just so great and like a total, kind of 180 turn from everything else. What was that like?
Yeah, I think it was, and that was from the brain of John Hoffman. John's got John's like vision of things and his creative vision of things is like limitless, which is so much, which is why it's so much fun working on this show. And on that, we sort of we wanted those moments to feel like, because what's happening is he's sort of in the early sort of stages of his patter song, just sort of like learning it, and he has sort of like his brain just freezes, and he can't get it, and then he starts sort of like he's in his head, and all of a sudden he's transported to this very, very weird world. And so John wanted it to feel like the most euphoric, happy world he could ever be in, and so that when we escape that world, we like for that first White Room scene, he sort of goes into this sort of like this mental collapse, and he's disappeared for a bit, and when he comes back, he's sitting there like, like on, I can't remember what it was, but he's like his hair is a mess. He's like it looks like he's almost like sitting on a toilet. I can't remember what it was that he came back from, but it was like you looked at him and you're like, where the hell have you been? And so we had to sort of transport you so far outside the show. Couldn't sound like anything you'd ever heard on the show. And it's sort of it was this like very sort of weird, psychedelic in a way, sort of like space he entered in. But that was so much fun, and that was one of those pieces that like I think I must have done 10 passes of that, of variations and versions of it until we finally got it. I mean, John was like, don't be afraid to be as weird as possible. And he's like, can you add raspberries to this? And I was like, I didn't even know what that was. And so that's like that sound you make, that with your mouth. And
Right.
so I was like, the percussion, some of it is me just going over and over again. It's like the most ridiculous. If you were to break down those tracks, and that's actually a fun thing. You're making me think that I should sort of like put that out there somewhere, like what made up those tracks. It's ridiculous. I even had my son, my 8-year-old son, in this studio, that there's a door stop that when you hit the door stop, it goes boing, 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 boing. It like boing, it's a boing, and we use that in it too. It's so outside and weird, um, but I'm glad John pushed me to get to where we got to in that.
Yeah, it makes for a memorable sequence for sure. Is it common to do that many passes, or is this more something like where the music kind of just flows out of you once you get the scene?
This is uncommon, because it's just, you get into a groove on the show. I sort of know the language of the show. It's like second nature to me at this point. I'm getting on a call today with our editor and on a scene in season 4 right now, and I know that like on the call, I'll watch the footage with her and I'll write it right there on the spot. Like in my head, I'll know what it needs to be. Whereas that one sort of took a stretch. I had to stretch. I had to think way outside, and so it was very new to the show. And sometimes in those sort of situations, you have to sort of you got to find it, and sometimes the best stuff comes from your 10th pass. Like and so I'm all for going down that rabbit hole and figuring out and finding out and pulling out what needs to be, what's ultimately the get that sort of the prize that you get from that investment in time is so worth it. And the fact that I forgot about that scene, the fact that you even brought that up I was like, okay, good, somebody did notice.
Yes, it's very memorable.
uh,
And you mentioned Pasek and Paul before. Did you have to
yeah.
have any kind of conversations about how does the music I'm creating kind of live alongside their songs this season, since that's a huge part of that
Yeah,
story?
of course. And it was on both sides, because I mean they were so collaborative and so incredible to sort of work with this season, and obviously their talent speaks for itself. But those guys, from my understanding, they also wanted their songs to feel like they could have come out of the score, and so like the song that Loretta sings, "For the Sake of a Child." Is it "For the Sake of a Child"? I forgot what
Hmm.
song it was. The one early on that she sings. It's like in the second episode or first episode. It's stunning, and then again later. Yeah, it was For the Sake of a Child, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, it begins with this little piano motif, and I think in their minds they were like, we want it to feel like this could be the score of the show, and they successfully did it, and but made it their own. You know, it was sort of like um, they just took they just worked with like the vernacular of the music a little bit, and made it their own thing and their own original thing, which was beautiful. So yeah, for me too, there were points where in the finale, for example, um, there are a bunch of there's a few huge sort of set piece songs that are happening, but then we're flashing back and forth between what happened that night, um, and and in some of those flashbacks, I needed to overlay some tension score that could sort of work along their songs and play underneath, to help support the the other side of the story, not just the song being performed. So we definitely had to work hand in hand. Um, but those guys are such pros and did such a wonderful job this season. They helped really elevate the show in a way that I think we're all still can't believe it happened that way.
Mm. Well, this is, clearly a very familiar world to you at this point.
Yeah.
And I know you also you're working on Elsbeth for
Yeah.
that score. What is that like coming into a show where, it's a spin-off of, the Good Fight universe there?
Right.
Do you feel like you have to sort of pull things from a pre-existing kind of musical landscape, or is there freedom to kind of go wherever you need to in that sense?
I think on that show, there's been, it's another example of just like wonderful collaboration. There's just really smart people who make great stuff, and that's what, and also incredibly professional. And the process has been really, really wonderful on that show. I didn't score the pilot, and so I came in episode two, and sort of had to come up with like a musical language for the series, and and knowing the sort of the work the Kings have done, they do just like exceptional work. I mean, it's like it's really beautiful. It's really well made television. It's exciting. It's fun. It's funny. All of that stuff that you enjoy. And for that show, I sort of looked at Elsbeth, and I was not familiar with any of the other I'm not familiar with any of where Elsbeth, Taschioni came from. I was not sort of like I wasn't I'd never seen anything with her in it before.
Hmm.
So I was sort of I came in with fresh eyes and ears, and so I didn't play it like it was a spinoff. I played it like this is a whole new thing. And I think that was also part of the charm of it, that like it didn't really I don't know what the language is. I still have not seen anything prior. So I remember just reading the script and watching the pilot and thinking, oh, this is a fish out of water, um, in New York, and she's sort of like the show is as much about her solving these mysteries as it is her being enamored by New York and the comedy of this person that doesn't quite belong, and that would like, that is equally obsessed with like going on like a ferry ride to see the Statue of Liberty as she is, trying to help solve a crime. I think that's like the charm of the show, and it almost gave me this like it reminded me of like Agent Cooper from Twin Peaks. He was like, he was there to like solve the horrific murder of Laura Palmer, but he can't stop talking about the cherry pie at the diner and the trees and the owls, and I think like all that sort of like weirdness, in the best possible way, is sort of baked into this show. And for me, that was sort of like, and also for me, Twin Peaks is my favorite show of all time. So, or one of top two for me. Sopranos is the other. But, so I think, I mean, I can see something and I can find some, and I'm like, oh, I remember in our meeting with the Kings, I was like, she's like Agent Cooper. And then they laughed and they're like, oh, that's kind of true.
Yeah. Well, it's great. We can't wait to see where that show goes and
Yeah.
where Only Murders will go in season four. So thank you so much, Sid, for sitting down and talking with me.
You're welcome. Thanks for your time. Appreciate you.